A small nation just did something that the world's second most powerful country said would cross a red line. On November 8, 2024, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. picked up a pen and signed two pieces of paper that would change everything. Within hours, Beijing summoned the Philippine ambassador, Chinese warships moved closer to contested waters, and the entire region held its breath. This wasn't just about lines on a map. This was about a country of 115 million people standing up to a superpower that outmatches them in every possible way, militarily and economically. And the decision they made would either protect their fishermen for generations to come or pull them into a confrontation they might not survive. The South China Sea stretches across 1.4 million square miles of some of the most contested waters on planet Earth. Every year, $5 trillion worth of trade passes through these shipping lanes. Beneath the waves lie an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. For the Philippines, these waters represent something even more fundamental: survival. Over 100,000 Filipino fishermen depend on these seas for their livelihoods, feeding their families from catches that have sustained coastal communities for centuries. But for the past decade, they have been slowly pushed out of waters their grandfathers fished freely, watching as foreign vessels appear on the horizon and force them to leave areas that international law says belong to the Philippines. China claims almost the entire South China Sea based on what they call historical rights dating back thousands of years. Their claim extends nearly 1,000 nautical miles from their mainland, reaching into waters just 80 miles from Philippine shores. To enforce this claim, China has built artificial islands on top of submerged reefs, transforming them into military bases complete with runways, radar systems, and missile batteries. They have deployed their Coast Guard vessels, not just in dozens, but in hundreds, creating what security analysts describe as a gray zone operation, where the lines between law enforcement and military action blur into strategic ambiguity. The Philippines has witnessed this expansion firsthand and felt its effects in ways both dramatic and mundane. Filipino fishermen returning to port with slashed nets tell stories of being chased from fishing grounds their families have worked for generations. Coast Guard personnel describe being blasted with water cannons powerful enough to shatter windows and injure crew members. In June 2024, during a routine resupply mission to the Sierra Madre, a Philippine Navy ship deliberately grounded on 2nd Thomas Shoal in 1999, Chinese Coast Guard vessels surrounded the Philippine boats. In the confrontation that followed, a Filipino sailor lost his thumb when Chinese personnel wielding axes and knives boarded and damaged Philippine vessels. The images went viral, showing the human cost of what diplomats politely call territorial disputes. President Marcos inherited a complicated situation when he took office in 2022. His predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, had pursued a policy of accommodation with Beijing, downplaying territorial disputes in exchange for Chinese investment in infrastructure projects. Duterte had essentially shelved a landmark 2016 ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, a ruling that invalidated China's expansive claims and affirmed Philippine sovereign rights under international law. The tribunal examined historical evidence, maritime boundaries, and treaty obligations before concluding that China's so-called 9-dash line had no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China immediately rejected the ruling, calling it nothing more than a piece of paper, and continued its island building and maritime expansion as if the judgment had never happened. Marcos made a different calculation. He recognized that his country's security and economic future depended on those waters remaining open and accessible. He watched as Chinese vessels increasingly operated not just near disputed features, but deep inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, areas where international law grants the Philippines sovereign rights to explore and exploit resources. He saw Filipino fishermen coming home with empty nets and stories of intimidation. He understood that waiting and hoping for Beijing to respect international law had not worked and would not work. Something had to change. The response came in the form of two laws that would fundamentally alter how the Philippines asserts its maritime rights. The Philippine Maritime Zones Act and the Philippine Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act were not just symbolic gestures or political theater. They represented a strategic shift from quiet diplomacy to open legal warfare, transforming international tribunal rulings and treaty obligations into Philippine domestic law. Senator Francis Tolentino, the principal author of the Maritime Zones Act, spent months developing legislation that would align Philippine law with the 2016 Arbitral Award and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. His team worked with maritime law experts, defense officials, and diplomats to craft language that was both legally sound and strategically necessary. The Maritime Zones Act does something remarkably straightforward but profoundly important. It defines in precise legal terms the Philippines' internal waters, archipelagic waters, territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf. It enshrines in Philippine law that the waters within the country's exclusive economic zone will be called the West Philippine Sea, removing the word China from the maritime domain. This might seem like a minor detail, a matter of naming conventions, but language matters in geopolitics. By legally designating these waters with a Philippine name, the law makes a statement about sovereignty and ownership that resonates far beyond the text of the legislation. More significantly, the law incorporates the geographic coordinates and boundaries established by the 2016 arbitral ruling, including areas around Scarborough Shoal and features in the Spratly Islands that China claims as its own territory. Under Philippine law, these waters are now unambiguously Philippine maritime zones, where Manila has sovereign rights to fish, explore for resources, and enforce its laws. The legislation provides the legal framework for the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy to operate in these waters not as intruders in disputed territory, but as law enforcement within their own jurisdiction. It gives legal teeth to what had previously been diplomatic assertions, transforming international law into domestic authority. The Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act addresses a different but equally important challenge. The Philippines consists of 7,641 islands, and foreign vessels regularly transit through Philippine waters, moving between the Pacific Ocean and the South China Sea. For years, Chinese naval vessels have sailed through these waters without notifying Philippine authorities, claiming rights to innocent passage while conducting what Manila describes as intelligence gathering and military operations. The new law establishes 3 designated sea lanes and air routes through the archipelago, setting out specific rights and obligations for vessels exercising passage rights. Foreign ships and aircraft can use these lanes, but they must follow the rules, respect Philippine sovereignty, and refrain from activities incompatible with innocent passage. President Marcos signed both laws on November 8, 2024, in a ceremony that was deliberately low-key but symbolically powerful. In his statement, he emphasized that these laws were not provocations but clarifications, aligning Philippine domestic law with international legal obligations. He spoke about Filipino fishermen who should be able to pursue their livelihoods without harassment, about the need to protect Philippine maritime resources for future generations, and about the country's commitment to international law. The message was clear: the Philippines was not backing down, and it was not asking for permission to exercise rights that international law already granted. China's response was immediate and predictable. Within hours, the Chinese Foreign Ministry summoned the Philippine ambassador to Beijing for what they called solemn representations. Spokesperson Mao Ning held a press conference where she described the laws as illegal, null, and void, a violation of Chinese territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. The ministry released a lengthy statement rejecting every premise of the Philippine legislation, reasserting China's historical claims, and warning that Beijing would take all necessary measures to defend its interests. The statement repeated familiar arguments about treaties from 1898 and 1900 that supposedly defined Philippine territorial limits, conveniently ignoring that those colonial-era agreements said nothing about exclusive economic zones or continental shelves, concepts that did not exist in international law until the mid-20th century. 2 days later, China escalated with a move that revealed just how seriously Beijing took the Philippine challenge. On November 10, 2024, China announced it was establishing official baselines for the territorial sea around Scarborough Shoal, the feature China calls Huangyan Island. This was not just a diplomatic protest. By declaring baselines, China was asserting that it would measure its territorial waters from these coordinates, effectively claiming legal authority over an area that the 2016 tribunal had ruled was within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. The announcement was a direct counter-move to the Philippine laws, an attempt to match legal assertion with legal assertion, drawing lines that contradicted everything the Philippines had just codified in its legislation. The China Coast Guard followed up with its own statement condemning what it called frequent provocations by Manila at Scarborough Shoal. The statement accused Philippine vessels of illegal intrusions and Filipino fishermen of using toxic substances to catch fish and targeting endangered species. These accusations, presented without evidence, fit a pattern where China portrays itself as the victim defending its territory against foreign aggression, flipping the narrative to cast the Philippines as the aggressor in its own exclusive economic zone. The Coast Guard pledged to maintain order in the relevant maritime areas, language that in practice meant more Chinese vessels, more confrontations, and more pressure on Filipino fishermen and Coast Guard personnel. The international response split along predictable but important lines. The United States issued a statement supporting the Philippine laws, with the State Department calling the Maritime Zones Act a routine matter that clarifies Philippine maritime law and upholds international law. Australia congratulated the Philippines on the passage of the legislation. Japan, which has its own maritime disputes with China, expressed understanding for Manila's position. These statements of support were not just diplomatic courtesy. They reflected a growing coalition of countries concerned about China's expansive maritime claims and willing to back nations like the Philippines that push back using legal and diplomatic tools rather than military force. The European Union and several European countries also voiced support for the Philippines, emphasizing the importance of international law and freedom of navigation. For the Philippines, this international backing was crucial. Manila understands it cannot match China's military power, but it can build a coalition of countries committed to rules-based order. Every statement of support, every diplomatic visit, every joint military exercise with the United States, Japan, or Australia adds to what strategists call deterrence by denial, making it harder for China to simply take what it wants without facing international consequences. What makes the Philippine strategy particularly interesting is how it combines legal warfare with transparency and alliance building. Unlike previous approaches that tried to manage tensions quietly behind closed doors, the Marcos administration has made Philippine-China confrontations public. When Chinese Coast Guard vessels ram Philippine boats, Manila releases videos showing exactly what happened. When Chinese forces use water cannons on resupply missions, Filipino personnel film the attacks and share them with international media. This transparency strategy serves multiple purposes. It builds domestic support by showing Filipinos that their government is defending national interests. It creates international awareness and sympathy for the Philippine position, and it puts pressure on China by documenting behavior that Beijing prefers to keep hidden or misrepresented. The alliance dimension is equally important. The Philippines has deepened its defense relationship with the United States to levels not seen in decades. In 2024, the two countries expanded the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement to include additional Philippine military bases where American forces can operate and store equipment. The United States deployed the Typhoon missile system to northern Philippines, a powerful ground-based launcher with a range of 1,600 kilometers that can reach deep into the South China Sea and potentially Chinese territory. This deployment drew furious protest from Beijing, which accused Washington of increasing the risk of conflict and using the Philippines as a proxy to contain China. But from Manila's perspective, hosting American military assets provides a degree of protection that Filipino forces alone cannot offer. The United States and the Philippines have a mutual defense treaty dating back to 1951, but for years there was ambiguity about whether that treaty would apply to incidents in the South China Sea. In March 2024, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin explicitly confirmed that American defense commitments extend to Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft in the South China Sea. This was not an abstract commitment. It meant that an attack on a Philippine vessel in the West Philippine Sea could trigger American military response, a significant deterrent against Chinese aggression. The Philippines has also strengthened partnerships with Japan and Australia. Japan has sold defense equipment to the Philippines and increased joint military exercises. Australia signed a status of visiting forces agreement that makes it easier for Australian military personnel to operate in the Philippines. Even Canada signed a similar agreement in late 2025. These partnerships create a web of relationships that raise the stakes for any potential Chinese military action. An attack on the Philippines would not just be a bilateral incident between Manila and Beijing. It would involve multiple countries with interests in maintaining open sea lanes and upholding international law. Yet for all this strategic maneuvering and alliance building, the situation remains fundamentally dangerous. China has not backed down from its claims and has actually intensified its activities in contested waters. In September 2025, Beijing announced plans to establish a nature reserve on Scarborough Shoal, a move that Manila immediately condemned as a pretext for occupation. Chinese vessels continue to harass Philippine fishing boats and block resupply missions. In February 2025, a Chinese military helicopter flew within 3 meters of a Philippine patrol plane over Scarborough Shoal, creating a 30-minute standoff that could have turned deadly with one wrong move or miscalculation. The economic dimension adds another layer of complexity. China is the Philippines' largest trading partner, and Chinese investment has funded infrastructure projects across the archipelago. Beijing has made clear that Manila's confrontational approach on maritime issues carries economic costs. Filipino exports have faced increased inspections and delays at Chinese ports. Investment commitments have slowed. There are hints of sanctions and restrictions that could be imposed if the Philippines continues down its current path. For President Marcos, this creates a difficult balancing act. Standing firm on territorial rights risks economic retaliation that could hurt Filipino workers and businesses. But backing down would mean abandoning sovereign rights and surrendering control over resources that the country desperately needs. Filipino fishermen remain caught in the middle of this geopolitical chess game. They continue to venture into traditional fishing grounds despite the risks, because fishing is not just their livelihood, but their way of life. Some report being followed by Chinese vessels equipped with powerful lights that blind them at night. Others describe being offered money by Chinese personnel to provide information or to stop fishing in certain areas. A few have been detained by Chinese forces and held for days before being released with warnings not to return. These are not abstract diplomatic disputes. They are daily realities for ordinary Filipinos trying to feed their families. The broader question is whether the Philippine strategy can actually work. Can a country with an economy 1/20th the size of China's and military capabilities that do not begin to match Chinese power successfully defend its maritime rights against a superpower determined to control the South China Sea? The answer depends on factors both within and beyond Philippine control. Domestically, it requires maintaining political will and national unity despite economic pressure and the constant risk of escalation. Internationally, it depends on the United States and other partners following through on their commitments when tensions spike and crises emerge. What the Philippine Maritime Zones Act and Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act have accomplished is to make the cost of Chinese expansion higher and more visible. Before these laws, China could incrementally expand control while maintaining plausible deniability about what it was doing. Now, every Chinese action that violates the laws can be called out as a violation not just of international law, but of Philippine domestic law, backed by the 2016 arbitral ruling. This makes it harder for other countries to ignore or downplay what is happening. It creates clear legal standards against which Chinese behavior can be judged. It gives the Philippines stronger grounds to seek international support and intervention. The laws also send a message to other Southeast Asian nations facing similar Chinese pressure. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei all have overlapping claims in the South China Sea, but none have been as willing as the Philippines to publicly challenge China or align so closely with the United States. Some countries in the region worry that the Philippine approach could provoke Chinese retaliation or drag them into conflicts they want to avoid. Others see the Philippine example as a model for how smaller nations can use law, transparency, and partnerships to push back against powerful neighbors. For China, the Philippine challenge represents a test case with implications beyond the South China Sea. If Manila succeeds in using legal frameworks and international support to effectively limit Chinese expansion, it could embolden other countries in territorial disputes with Beijing. If the Philippines fails or is forced to back down through economic pressure or military intimidation, it would confirm that might makes right in international relations, and that international law means little when opposed by great power interests. Beijing has made enormous investments in building its South China Sea presence, not just in terms of money, but in terms of prestige and credibility. Walking back those claims would be politically costly for Chinese leaders. As 2026 unfolds, the South China Sea remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. The Philippines has made its choice, codifying its maritime claims in law, and betting that international support and alliance commitments will protect it from the full weight of Chinese power. Every resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal, every fishing expedition to Scarborough Shoal, every joint patrol with American or Australian forces tests whether that bet will pay off. Filipino Coast Guard personnel wake up each day knowing they might face Chinese vessels that outgun them. Diplomats work overtime managing relationships and building support. Fishermen continue casting their nets in waters their ancestors fished, hoping this will be a day without confrontation. The stakes could not be higher. If the Philippines succeeds in defending its maritime rights through law and alliances, it offers a roadmap for other small nations facing pressure from powerful neighbors. It proves that international law and collective security can work even in an era of rising great power competition. But if the strategy fails, if China succeeds in controlling the South China Sea despite legal rulings and international opposition, it would mark a turning point where power once again trumps law, where sovereignty depends on military strength rather than legal rights, and where the rules-based international order that has provided a framework for peace and prosperity begins to crumble. For now, the Philippines stands firm, armed with new laws, backed by international partners, and determined to protect waters that generations of Filipinos have considered their own. The world watches to see whether a nation of islands can defend itself against a rising superpower, or whether the South China Sea will become a Chinese lake despite everything international law says to the contrary. The answer to that question will shape not just the future of Philippine fishermen and their families, but the future of international order itself. And it all started with the stroke of a pen on two pieces of paper that made the world's second most powerful country furious.